In the Grand Museum of World War II history, we often focus on the giants, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the Tiger tank, or the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. But there was a tiny glass and copper miracle tucked inside the nose of an artillery shell that changed the trajectory of the conflict just as surely as the atomic bomb. It was a piece of technology so sensitive, so secret, and so vital that American commanders were forbidden from even mentioning its name in unencrypted dispatches. For the first 3 years of the war, the physics of destruction were simple and brutally binary. You either hit your target or you missed. Traditional anti-aircraft fire relied on 2 types of fuses. The first was the contact fuse, which only exploded if the shell physically struck the thin aluminum wing of a plane, a feat of marksmanship comparable to hitting a flying dragonfly with a pebble from a mile away. The second was the time fuse, where a mechanical clockwork device was set by hand before firing. The gunner would guess the altitude of the enemy, set the timer, and hope the shell exploded near the plane. But planes move. They dive, they bank, and they accelerate. In the secret laboratories of the Section T Division in Washington and the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins, scientists were chasing a ghost. They were building a weapon that didn't need a direct hit. They were creating an intelligent shell that possessed its own eyes and its own brain, a weapon that decided for itself exactly when to die. If this technology had been perfected and deployed just 12 months earlier, the maps of Europe and the Pacific might look very different today. By 1940, the Allied war effort was bleeding out in the sky. During the Blitz over London and the early naval battles in the Pacific, the math of anti-aircraft warfare had become a joke, and a deadly one at that. Enemy aircraft, like the Japanese Zero or the German Messerschmitt, were becoming faster, more agile, and harder to track. The Allied gunners on the decks of destroyers would fill the sky with thousands of pounds of steel, turning the horizon into a wall of black smoke and jagged shrapnel. Yet the vast majority of those shells did nothing. They would soar past the enemy, exploding harmlessly thousands of feet above or below their mark. The statistics from the Royal Navy were staggering. It was estimated that for every single enemy plane shot down, the Allies had to fire nearly 20,000 rounds of ammunition. This was a logistical nightmare. Ships were running out of shells during a single engagement. Coastal batteries were firing blindly into the dark, wasting tons of precious cordite and steel for a hit probability that was practically zero. The war was becoming an industrial race that the Allies were barely winning simply because they couldn't hit what they were aiming at. Something fundamental had to change. The shell itself had to become aware of its surroundings. The solution proposed by a small group of visionary physicists sounded like something out of a pulp science fiction novel. They suggested shrinking a 5-tube radio transmitter and receiver down to the size of a light bulb and stuffing it into the tip of a 5-inch artillery shell. The concept was known as the variable time fuse, or more commonly, the proximity fuse. The theory was elegant. As the shell traveled through the air, the tiny radio would emit a continuous signal. When that signal bounced off a piece of metal, be it an aircraft wing, a fuselage, or a ship's hull, the reflected waves would create an interference pattern. The fuse would detect this change in frequency, realize it was within the kill zone, roughly 70 feet from the target, and trigger the explosive charge. When the military high command heard the proposal, they called it an engineering impossibility, and they had good reason. To make a proximity fuse work, scientists had to overcome 3 physical barriers that seemed insurmountable. Extreme acceleration. When an artillery shell is fired, it is subjected to a force of roughly 20,000 Gs. This is enough to crush a standard vacuum tube into powder. Extreme spin. The rifling in a gun barrel spins a shell at over 25,000 revolutions per minute. This centrifugal force would tear ordinary electronics apart. The battery problem. You couldn't use a standard battery, it would leak or lose its charge. They needed a power source that remained dead while sitting on a shelf, but would instantly wake up the moment the gun was fired. The engineers were told it couldn't be done. They were told that glass tubes and delicate copper wires were too fragile for the violent world of the big guns. They took that skepticism, went into their labs, and built it anyway. The breakthrough came from a relentless process of test and destroy. To solve the fragility problem, the team began ruggedizing vacuum tubes. They encased the delicate filaments in blocks of solid plastic and wax. They tested them by firing them out of smoothed-out shotguns and dropping them from the tops of buildings. For the battery, they created a reserve cell. It contained a small glass ampule of liquid electrolyte. When the shell was fired, the massive shock of the launch would shatter the glass, and the spinning motion of the shell would sling the liquid into the plates, instantly generating electricity. The shell quite literally came to life only after it left the barrel. By 1943, the United States was producing these fuses by the millions. The cost was astronomical, equivalent to the Manhattan Project in terms of industrial effort, but the result was a weapon that made Allied gunners 5 to 7 times more effective overnight. However, because the technology was so revolutionary, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a terrifyingly strict order: the proximity fuse must never be used over land. They were terrified that a dud shell might fall into German hands, allowing Nazi scientists to reverse engineer the radio technology and use it against Allied bomber streams. For over a year, this miracle was restricted to the open ocean, where duds would sink to the bottom of the sea, taking their secrets with them. The proximity fuse was not merely a piece of hardware, it was a miniaturized masterpiece of 1940s physics. To understand why it was so revolutionary, you have to look past the heavy steel casing of a standard 5-inch naval shell and peer into the nose cone. There, packed into a space no larger than a pint glass, sat a complete, functioning radio station. The interior of the shell was a miracle of condensed engineering. It contained a vacuum tube radio, 5 tiny glass tubes that acted as both transmitter and receiver. In an era when most radios were the size of a microwave, these were the size of a thimble. A miniature reserve battery, a power source that sat dry for years, only activating when the shock of firing shattered a glass ampule of electrolyte, allowing the spinning centrifugal force to wet the plates and generate current in milliseconds. A decision circuit, a primitive but effective brain that measured the Doppler shift of the reflected radio waves. It didn't just listen, it analyzed. The greatest hurdle, however, was the physics of the gun itself. When that shell was fired, it was subjected to a staggering 20,000 G-forces. For comparison, a fighter pilot in a steep turn might experience 9 Gs. To the fragile glass of a vacuum tube, 20,000 Gs should have been like hitting a brick wall at terminal velocity. It shouldn't have survived the barrel, let alone the flight. But through the use of ruggedized components, tubes encased in solid blocks of resin and wax, it did survive. And when the first batch was tested at a secret range in New Mexico, the results were nothing short of terrifying. Drone targets were being swatted out of the sky without the shell ever making physical contact. Miss rates, which had once been the primary frustration of every gunnery officer, collapsed instantly. Kill ratios skyrocketed by over 500%. This wasn't just a marginal improvement in ballistics, it was the birth of smart weaponry. As soon as the Joint Chiefs of Staff saw the data, they realized they were holding a double-edged sword. The proximity fuse was so effective that it threatened to fundamentally break the balance of the air war, but only if the Allies maintained a total monopoly on the secret. The fear in Washington was visceral. If even a single unexploded dud shell fell into enemy territory, German or Japanese engineers could recover the components, reverse engineer the radio circuits, and realize exactly how the Americans were achieving such impossible accuracy. Worse, they could develop jamming technology to trick the shells into exploding prematurely, turning the Allies' greatest strength into a liability. Consequently, the most draconian security measures of the war were enacted. Strict, non-negotiable orders were issued to every theater commander. Never use it over land. The shells were strictly prohibited for use in continental Europe or North Africa. If a shell landed in a field and failed to deter, it was a gift to the Nazi scientists in Berlin. Never use it near debris recovery. The weapon was restricted almost exclusively to the open ocean, where duds would sink to the abyss of the Pacific or the Atlantic, taking their secrets with them. For years, as Allied soldiers died in foxholes and bomber crews were shredded by the Luftwaffe fighters, one of the most decisive weapons in the arsenal was deliberately kept in the shadows. It was a secret kept under lock and key, a silent guardian that the High Command refused to unleash until the stakes were so high that they had no other choice. The breaking point arrived in the summer of 1944. Germany, desperate to turn the tide after the D-Day landings, launched its vengeance weapons, the V-1 flying bombs. These were the world's first cruise missiles, small pulse jet-powered drones that droned across the English Channel with a terrifying buzz aimed directly at the heart of London. Traditional anti-aircraft fire was nearly useless against them. The V-1s were small, remarkably fast for the time, and followed a straight, low-altitude path that made them difficult for mechanical time-fused shells to intercept. London was burning, and the civil death toll was mounting. The rules of the war had to change. In a moment of high-stakes gambling, the Allied command finally authorized the use of the proximity fuse. Batteries of 90mm guns were lined up along the British coast, equipped with the funny fuses and linked to the new SCR-58 radar systems. The results were instantaneous and surgical. Within weeks, the interception rates, which had been lagging under 20%, surged to over 80%. On one remarkable day, out of 104 V-1s detected, 68 were destroyed by proximity-fused fire. The sky over the Channel became a wall of lethal radio waves. The buzz bombs weren't just being shot at, they were being hunted by the shells themselves. This success gave the Allies the confidence they needed for the final push. By late 1944, during the freezing chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, the ban on land use was finally lifted. For the first time, German infantry and Tiger tanks faced an artillery barrage that didn't bury itself in the mud, but exploded exactly 20 feet in the air, raining shrapnel down with a precision that broke the back of the German offensive. The secret was out, and it was the sound of the war's end. As the smoke cleared over the battlefields of 1945, historians and military strategists began to pick through the wreckage of the conflict, and they stumbled upon a dangerous, haunting question. What if the proximity fuse had been unleashed sooner? The technology was technically ready and mass-produced by early 1943. Yet for nearly 2 years it was kept in a state of artificial hibernation, restricted to the waves of the Pacific or the deep Atlantic. While the Allied High Command sat on this miracle, the war took a staggering toll. Over Europe, in 1943 and early 1944, the 8th Air Force was being bled white during daylight bombing raids over Germany. Thousands of young men in B-17s were shredded by the Luftwaffe fighters. If those bombers had been protected by escort ships or ground batteries armed with proximity fuses, the German Air Force might have been neutralized a year earlier. Over Japan, the long, brutal island-hopping campaign was defined by the terror of the kamikaze. Thousands of sailors died because traditional anti-aircraft fire simply couldn't track a suicide plane with enough precision to stop it before impact. Over the cities, the V-1 buzz bomb campaign against London caused 22,000 casualties. For months, the proximity fuse sat in warehouses while those bombs fell, withheld because of the theoretical fear that the Germans might find a single unexploded shell. The logic of the era was dominated by the fear of imitation. The Pentagon was so terrified that the Axis powers would copy the technology that they allowed the war to continue using inferior methods. It was a strategic gamble. They traded lives in the present for the security of a secret in the future. Victory had been slowed by the very caution intended to protect it. Had the shell with a brain been deployed over the heart of Germany in 1943, the Luftwaffe would have faced an invisible wall of fire that no pilot, no matter how skilled, could have bypassed. In the decades following the surrender of Japan, the narrative of World War II was rewritten by the loudest and most visible technologies. The jet engine promised a new era of travel and speed. Radar became the backbone of modern navigation, and of course, the atomic bomb cast a shadow so large it eclipsed almost everything else, rewriting the very ethics of human conflict. The proximity fuse, meanwhile, quietly faded into the footnotes of history. It was too small to be a spectacle, too technical to be a household name, and its development had been so shrouded in cosmic levels of secrecy that even the men who fired the shells often didn't know why they were suddenly so much more accurate. Yet those who sat in the high command, the men who actually managed the mathematics of death, knew the truth. General James Leary called it the most important development in the art of war. Admiral Lewis Strauss, a key figure in the development of both the fuse and later the hydrogen bomb, placed it in a trinity of triumph. He stated that the war was won by three things: the courage of the soldier, the mass production of the American factory, and three specific inventions. While the atomic bomb ended the war, the proximity fuse made victory possible. It was the weapon that allowed the Allied fleets to survive the Pacific, the weapon that saved London from the V-1, and the weapon that allowed Patton to break the German lines in the Ardennes. It was a masterpiece of the close enough, a weapon that never needed a direct hit to change the world. It only needed to be near. The story of the proximity fuse is the story of the birth of the electronic age. It represents the moment warfare stopped being a contest of mechanical levers and gears and became a contest of invisible waves and logic circuits. It was the first smart weapon, the ancestor of every guided missile and fire-and-forget system used by modern militaries today. But more than that, it is a reminder of the hidden nature of progress. We often think of history as a series of grand, visible breakthroughs. We forget that sometimes the technology that changes everything, the invention that tilts the balance of empires, is a tiny glass tube tucked inside a piece of steel, hidden away because it is too powerful to be seen. The proximity fuse remained a ghost in the machine, a secret kept so well that even 80 years later, its impact is rarely discussed. It proved that in the theater of war, the most dangerous thing isn't the explosion you see, it's the radio wave you don't, the silent signal that watches, waits, and decides for itself when the end has arrived.